we just saw how to access and mutate an object's attributes, but specifically, how is a new object constructed? A new object is constructed with the new keyword. You start with like how you'd create any other variable with the type, variable name, and then you say new bank account. And then when you say new, the object name with this parentheses, you're calling the constructor of the bank account. So it's saying create a new bank account. And the constructor is a special method used to initialize an object's attributes at time of creation or construction, as it says. The constructor does not need to be explicitly defined, and a constructor is called every time a new object is created because it constructs the object. So here's the demo. Here I say they do not need to be explicitly defined. And as we've seen in our demos before, I have no constructor here, well, except for this. So in our example, we just created the new bank account. But the holder and balance got initialized to whatever it was set to initially here. But that's not always the case, because sometimes you want to construct a new object with different values, some custom values. So when I say that a constructor does not need to be explicitly defined, if you don't explicitly write your own constructor, Java creates one for you, and that constructor is called whenever you create a new instance of that class. And it's basically like this. This is what a constructor looks like. It's the class name, and that's it. And inside the suite of this method, you would initialize your values. So you could say this.holder equals Evan here. But if you don't define the constructor, then it does nothing. So now that we've defined it, let's see what happens when we try to compile this. Okay. Right. So rather than calling the default constructor, now it calls this constructor that you've written. See? Right here. It looks exactly like a method call. And inside this method, or inside the constructor, we print I'm in the constructor. So now we see here I'm in the constructor, initial name, whatever, whatever. And then the same stuff. But it's often the case when you want to initialize a object with some other values. So say when we initially create the object, we want to create it with a different name other than this blank at construction time. So we can do this by adding an argument, or creating a different constructor with an argument in it. So this dot holder equals holder. Okay. And then we'll see here now that our initial name will be different. Oh, let's also print some stuff. Alright, so I forgot this. But so if you change the constructor and you add an argument to it, then when you construct it, you need to add an argument here. So let's pass in Chad. So see now, the object is constructed differently because inside the constructor, I initialize the name to something else. And so that brings us to the last topic, which is method overloading. And this means defining multiple methods with the same name. And this is allowed if their arguments are different. So here's a simple example or I have two versions of add, I can call them the same thing as long as the arguments are different. In this first example, it takes in two numbers and I add those two numbers together. In this line, add takes three numbers and adds those three numbers together. And this is allowed because the arguments must be either a different type or there must be a different number of arguments, and then Java can differentiate between them. So this is called overloading, and of course works for constructors too, not just regular methods. Java figures out which method is being called given the arguments that are passed in. And so let's do a demo. I'll change this back to taking in nothing. So here we have our original constructor, the default constructor that does nothing, right? And then I can overload the constructor by changing the arguments. So I add this argument holder. I call it the exact same thing. I'm in the second constructor, and I set the holder in here. So if I go down here, I comment this out. So to test this, I create a second account, and I use a different constructor. I pass in this argument, Chad. Okay, so we can test this. And here we see, here's all our initial stuff. The default constructor doesn't initialize anything, so that's why we have null and 100. But when we overload the constructor to create another object, we see it was named Chad, because we call it with the different constructor. And you can actually have any arbitrary number of constructor or of overloaded methods as you want. So we can actually create a third constructor where we take in a balance as well. So let's change this to third. Okay, so this constructor takes in a holder and a balance. Comment this out to see what it prints out. Okay, so we create a third account, and we call it with this these two arguments, a name and then an amount. Save it. So here we see the second account gets their name initialized, and the third account gets their name and the balance initialized to something new. So yep, that's how you overload a method. It doesn't just work with constructors. You just create a method with the same name, but you change the number of arguments, and then when you call it, Java figures out which method you're referring to given the arguments that you input. And this is useful because sometimes you want to call in a method with a different number of arguments like we saw in this constructor. Sometimes you want to set the name, sometimes you don't want to set anything, and sometimes you want to set a name or multiple values at the same time.